Friends, I am glad to announce and introduce our speaker, Dr. Chris Thorogood, the Deputy Director and Head of Science at the Oxford Botanic Garden and Arboretum. His research broadly centers on exploring fundamental processes in plant evolutionary ecology using molecular tools with specific foci on host specificity in parasitic plants and how this can drive speciation, novel ecological processes driving speciation in carnivorous Nepenthes pitcher plants, and the taxonomic circumscription of the Mediterranean basin floristic region. Dr. Thorogood is also responsible for public engagement linked to research at the Botanic Garden and Arboretum in collaboration with the Oxford Department of Plant Sciences. So everyone, let us all welcome Dr. Chris Thorogood.
Okay, just shout if there are any problems. This isn't my laptop, by the way, so I'm not I'm not very proficient with the technology. I was just saying that I wanted to say thank you, my sincere thanks to the director Marianne de Leon, and also to Professor Pat Malabrigo for inviting me to give this online seminar. And it's an absolute pleasure to join you all today online. I also wanted to paint a picture for you of where I'm sitting right now, because about 30 meters from where I am, there are treetops dripping with epiphytes, wild orchids, ferns, medinillas, jade vines. And for the botanist, this really is paradise. So I'm joining you today from the land grants, the University of the Philippines land grants here in the Philippines. And I feel the luckiest guy in the world to be in this wonderful part of the world with a flora beyond compare. Specifically today, I'd like to talk to you about a very intriguing group of plants. The majority of my talk is going to be focused on parasitic plants, or as I refer to them later, the vampires of the plant kingdom. These are the plants that pilfer their existence, they steal their food from other plants. And so I'm going to take you on a bit of a safari of some of the weirdest plant biology around the plant world. Before I do so, I'd like to take you back some 10 or 11,000 kilometers to the UK. So this is where I work in Oxford. This is the University of Oxford Botanic Garden. And for those who don't know, I'll just explain a little bit about the Botanic Garden. It's the oldest one in the UK, so it was founded in 1621, so 401 years ago this July. So we're celebrating our 400th anniversary. And so being 4 centuries old, it's a place that's very much steeped in history because it was shaped over the course of 4 centuries of different intellectual, political and economic conditions. And it was really the birthplace of botanical science in the UK. So it's a very special place to work. It's quite small. It's just a few acres in the city centre of Oxford, but it's like a little green oasis. And like most botanic gardens, we have foci on conservation, research, education, and public engagement. And today in my talk, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the research that we do. Specifically, I promised you vampires, but I also want to give you some killers before I get going. So I'll just touch upon some carnivorous plants, which it would be remiss of me not to do so, given I'm in the home of some of the best carnivorous plants in the whole world in Southeast Asia. Then I'm going to get going with our safari of vampires. So I'm going to explain what these plants are and why I've called them that. So I'm going to talk about heterotrophic plants. I'm then going to talk about some of the very weirdest parasitic plants called endoparasites, and I'll explain a little bit about their biology. Then I'm going to talk about some of the groups that I've specialized in and also some applications and why they might be useful. Towards the end of my talk, I also want to touch upon another area of my research, which isn't directly linked to parasitic plants, but I think it's interesting nevertheless. It's biomimetics, so the applications of plants in technology, so how plants can help us. And I'm going to end with astonishing plants, but I'll explain more about what I mean by that at the end. So without further ado, these are the sorts of plants that I get excited by. These are the things that keep me awake at night, and maybe some of you too. I've always found weird plants fascinating. So when I was a kid, my bedroom was festooned with all sorts of botanical oddities that used to festoon the window poles and squirting cucumbers that fired missiles of seeds down the stairs. So that was the kind of kid I was, and I knew that I wanted to be a botanist. And now I feel like I have the best job in the world because I get to work on these plants for a living. I'm a scientist, and so when I look at a living thing, I ask, why is it like this? How did it evolve to be this way? And I've taken these questions with me my whole life, and I still ask these questions today, and that's my compass for my research. Asking questions about how some of these plants function and how they evolve to be the way they are. And as a botanist, I get to visit some incredible places around the world. So whether it's looking for rare alliums in minefields or, excuse the noise, climbing on high cliff tops in search of rare flora, I'm never happier than when I'm looking at plants. And that's why I'm particularly excited at the moment to be here in the Philippines, looking at some of what I think are the most extraordinary plants in the whole plant kingdom. But I'm going to start off with the killers briefly before I talk about the parasitic plants. What do I mean by that? These are the carnivorous plants, the predators of the plant kingdom. And there's a whole range of plants that have evolved an arsenal, if you like, of leafy tricks, traps, and snares that entice and attract animal prey, usually in the form of insects. Some of them are very familiar, like that Venus flytrap on the left, which is related to distantly to the sundew in the middle, which has sticky glue to attract and suffocate insect prey. Neither of these two are related to the pitcher plant on the right. That belongs to a different order. And actually, I should mention at this point that for a long period of time, these plants really baffled evolutionary biologists. We were unsure about what was related to what and how they evolved. And it was really only with the advent of DNA sequencing technology, particularly in the 1990s, that we started to understand how these plants are related to one another. And it threw up all sorts of surprises. I'm particularly interested in these plants, which I think are some of the most beautiful plants there are. These are Nepenthes pitcher plants, which I'm sure many, if not all of you, will be familiar with or at least aware of. So these are carnivores that come predominantly from Southeast Asia, so where I am now. And on the slide, you can see some photos that a colleague has taken and shared with me of pitcher plants from the Philippines, where I am now. And aren't they absolutely beautiful? The what look like normal leaves, as it were, are actually the midrib, so the leaf stalks that you're familiar with in most plants. And the leaf itself is what evolved to form that tubular pitcher, the trap that attracts and traps insects. Because these are plants that use insects or animal prey to supplement their source of nitrogen predominantly, and also to an extent phosphorus. And this enables them to survive in nutrient-poor conditions. So carnivorous plants evolved in parts of the world that are often very rain-leached. So it's raining right now, and it has been since I've been here today. And these are the sorts of environments where nutrients leach out of the soil. And so it gives these plants a very strong selective advantage if they're able to sequester nitrogen from another source. It enables them to compete with other plants. And so that's an insight into how they evolved. One of my favorite places in the whole world, actually, is this extraordinary mountain called Mount Kinabalu in North Borneo, in Sabah. And this is home to many species of Nepenthes and also hundreds of different orchids too. It's an ultramafic substrate, so it's a kind of environment that many plants can't grow on, but these pitcher plants, they thrive there. And this is a mountain that a famous botanist called Corner described as having the most remarkable assemblage of plants in the world. And I have to say, I'm inclined to agree. It's an extraordinary place. These are some of the pitcher plants that you'll find growing there. Nepenthes villosa, the one on the left, with its formidable toothed peristome that grows in the upper reaches of the mountain. The largest of them all, Nepenthes raja in the middle, which has traps the size of buckets, and I'll explain why in a moment. And then that's a hybrid on the right. So some really extraordinary plants grow on that very special mountain. This is a bit of a complicated slide, but I'll help navigate us through from left to right. So I mentioned before that evolutionary biologists were perplexed as to how these extraordinary and quite complex plants evolved. We believe that Nepenthes pitcher plants evolved from something perhaps a bit like a sundew, that sticky plant that you can see on the left with a fly stuck to it. And actually, if we look under high-powered electron microscopy, what we see is that those stalked glands, that black and white picture on the top, those are the glands of a sundew. And then the ones below that, those are on the inner surface of a pitcher plant. And what we think has happened over evolutionary time is that these sticky leaves have become enclosed to form a sort of tube. And the glands that once would have been on the outside ended up on the inside. And they produce this sticky liquid at the bottom of the trap. And the insects now tumble into that fluid. And then they drown and they break down and release nutrients for the plant. And what are the environments in which these plants may have evolved? Well, a scientist called Gibnish first put forward a model which I've simplified there on the right. And so we have this situation where the plant takes up nutrients from the soil, like most plants do, but it also receives nutrients in the form of prey, that P that I put on the diagram on the left. And then these nutrients fuel the rest of the plant, so the production of its leaves, of its pitchers. But there's an important consideration here, because if you look at that picture of the pitcher plant in the middle, what you'll see is that it's a yellowish color, it's not very green, and it's of a certain tubular shape that isn't very effective at catching light. So there is a bit of a trade-off here, because the plant grows in an environment where there isn't much in the way of nutrients, and yet its pitchers are not very efficient at catching light either. So what we understand here is that these plants must grow in an environment where, number one, their traps give them a strong advantage, which of course they do where nutrients are scarce, because other plants don't have this advantage. And number two, it must grow where there's lots of sunlight. And typically these pitcher plants do grow in environments of high light. They can't prosper very well in high shade environments because their pitchers are not very efficient at capturing light. So those are some insights into how these plants may have evolved. Some of them are really quite extraordinary, and they've shifted away from their diet of insects and in the form of prey, and they effectively function as tree shrew toilets. So the work of other scientists a few years ago, they looked at the geometry of these pitchers, and they found that they're very sturdy and woody, and they're of an optimal shape and size. That means that these little creatures that scurry about on the mountainsides can cling on to the pitchers. They feed on the nectar on the inner surface of the lid, and at the same time they defecate, so their droppings fall down into the pitcher where they're a source of nutrients for the plant. And this has really only been discovered within the last decade. So I find it extraordinary that some of these plants that I used to marvel at as a kid looking in books when I was young, we really didn't understand then how some of them function. Many of the plants that grow around here in the Philippines now, we haven't yet really looked at what some of these plants are feeding on and how they work. And there might be all sorts of intriguing stories to be found with some of those plants too. This is a species called Nepenthes hemsliana. And this one, its pitchers are roosting sites for woolly bats. So the bats find this of just the right shape and size. It's cozy for them to crawl inside, cling on to that ridge you can see around the middle. And they sit in there and do what bats do during the day, and which is not a lot. And every so often they'll release droppings and urine, which go down into the pitcher and feed the plant. And then at night they'll leave the pitcher and go off and hunt and do what bats do. And so all the good gardeners among us know that what plants really benefit from is fertilizer and manure. And so, of course, that is what these plants are tapping into. Just before I leave the killer plants, I just want to touch upon some of the work I do with these other scientists you can see on the screen here at the Mathematical Institute at the University of Oxford. And we're really intrigued by the peristomes, those ornate toothy structures at the top of the picture. And we want to understand, why are they so different, and do they perform differently? And so my very clever colleagues have spent a lot of time doing mathematical modeling to produce 3D geometries and replicas virtually of these plants. And what we found is, I think there's a slight delay in the slides, but in a second you'll see a graph. And what we found is that they behave differently in terms of how slippery they are. So hopefully you can see the graph in front of you. I'm looking at my colleague's screen, but it's not appeared yet. Yeah, okay. So on the graph, you'll see that towards the right, we've modeled peristomes that are 97% safe for insects to walk on. And these are peristomes that are completely dry. And I should say that these tracks are slippery when they're wet, but when they're dry, the insects can walk around on 97% of the surface and they don't fall in. As the peristome becomes wetter, so if you pan from right to left, what you'll see is that the relative area upon which the insects can walk becomes less and less. In other words, it becomes more dangerous. But what we find interesting is that just with the few examples we've looked at so far, is that it doesn't necessarily all happen at the same rate. And so different geometries of these peristomes function in different ways. And so these insects might be responding in a different way too. And we're really interested to understand how does that play out across all of the different pitcher plants, because there are so many different shapes and sizes of these peristomes. They seem to behave differently. And maybe that means that they are trapping different prey in nature. It raises all sorts of intriguing questions. Now, I promised you vampires, so I'm going to move on to the next part of my talk. And I want to talk about parasitic plants. The reason I called these vampires, a fanciful term, is because these are plants that effectively suck the sap out of the roots and sometimes the stems of other plants. And they've evolved multiple times, 12 times in fact, across the flowering plants, the angiosperms. So on the next slide, I've mapped the different 12 lineages, and you can see some of the diversity of these extraordinary plants. What these plants are united by is a special structure called a haustorium. And you can think of that as like a plug. It basically plugs itself into the vascular tissues of its host, and it siphons off water and solutes from the host to feed the parasites. Some of these parasitic plants are highly derived, and as such, they have lost their leaves, their roots, and in some cases, all trace of photosynthesis as well. And for this reason, they scarcely even resemble plants at all. And many people originally thought they were fungi, which they're not at all. So a very intriguing and unusual group of plants. And they have a profound impact on ecosystems as well. So particularly in temperate grassland systems, some of these parasites, they selectively take their food from some plants, suppressing their dominance and allowing other plants to prosper. So they have quite an important, they're sort of keystone species that have an important effect on ecosystems. Meanwhile, others have become weeds, so they attack commercial crops. So there are lots of reasons to study these extraordinary plants. On the next slide, I've just shown a few different heterotrophic plants, by which I mean plants that do not photosynthesize, because really these are parasites as well. So we used to think of these as something called saprophytes, but we now know that these are parasitic on fungi. So the majority of land plants, for at least some of their life cycle, have a dependency on fungi for their nutrition and for their existence. But there are some plants that have taken that relationship to a new level, and they are parasitic on those fungi. So whereas we saw plants that were parasitic on other plants, these ones that you can see here are parasitic on other fungi, and they have some bizarre shaped sizes and colors. The one on the left that you can see there, that's an underground orchid called Rhizanthella in Australia. That blue one, which I think is an extraordinary plant, is called Oxygyna, and that occurs in some of the tropical islands of Japan and also Africa. And then we've got some Thismia species on the right, which if there's time, I'll talk about in a little while. On the next slide, I'd like to share with you some of the most bizarre plants that there are in terms of their biology. And these are the endoparasites. So these have taken their life cycle to absolute extremes. These are the plants that are no longer free living in any way. They actually live inside, embedded inside the tissues of their host plants. So they've evolved to live rather like a fungus in a way, and I'll explain more in a second, as a series of filaments inside their host tissues. And when scientists had first discovered and observed these plants, they thought that they must all be related to one another and that they evolved from common ancestry, because, you know, what are the chances of something having evolved such a similar life history multiple times? But DNA shows us that that's exactly what has happened. So these parasitic plants that live inside plants have evolved 4 times, and I've matched those there on the left on the flowering plants family tree. So you can see that irrefutably they evolved multiple times. And we know a little bit about their biology, but not a lot. And we have some ideas about how they may have evolved. They tend to like growing on woody, slow-growing hosts, which maybe provides a stable environment for them to live inside. On the next slide, I've shown the most spectacular plant of them all, Rafflesia. The one you can see, if the slide catches up in a second, is Rafflesia arnoldii, which grows particularly in Sumatra. And it's a botanical enigma. So its flowers grow to an astonishing meter across. If ever there was a vegetable vampire, this is it. Yeah, this is a plant that has intrigued, astonished, and mesmerized botanists and naturalists for many years. And in many ways, we still understand rather little about these plants, even though they produce the largest flowers on Earth. So as I mentioned, they live as a series of threads inside their host vine. This is a painting I've done of it, and you can see the vines on the left. Those are its hosts. It's called a tetrastigma, which is a relative of grapevines that lives in the rainforests. And the Rafflesia lives inside the tissues of the tetrastigma, and then eventually it produces these giant cabbage-like buds that erupt through the surface of the rainforest floor and open to reveal these extraordinary flowers. On the next slide, I've just charted some of the life cycle of Rafflesia. And what I really want to show here is just how remarkably similar these plants are to fungi. So working with my colleagues, Chuck Davies and others, we examined in greater detail the life history of some of these endoparasitic plants. And I've broken it down into some simple steps and explained why we think there are some interesting parallels with fungi. So parasitic plant seeds like Rafflesia start life as tiny little seeds, or in the case of fungi, as spores, and they respond to chemical cues, so chemicals, signals that are produced by all plants, but in this case, they must be the specific ones of the right plants, and then they germinate, and then they attach. In the case of parasitic plants, they produce that haustorium, that plug that I mentioned, that siphons off food, and in the case of fungi, it's an acrosorium. And then they go undercover, so they go down inside the tissues of their host, and in the case of Rafflesia, it produces these uniseriate filaments that sort of spread within the tissues of their host undetected. And in the case of fungi, they grow intracellularly, but in other ways, they're quite similar anatomically. And then they produce these giant fruiting bodies that disperse either seeds or spores, respectively. And there are also similarities at the molecular level as well. So there's an elevated level of communication between host and parasite. And in Chuck's group, they've examined this extensively and found that horizontal gene transfers, HGTs, have been rampant in the Rafflesiaceae family. So bits of the genome of the host that have ended up laterally transferred rather than through inheritance, as we think of genes being transferred in these parasitic plants. So they've ended up with all kinds of interesting things in their genomes from former host associations. Now, on the next slide, I've just shown the 4 different types of endoparasites, and I've also shown them under the microscope. And I don't wish to dwell on this slide and talk about the microscopy too much. But again, what I want to say is that they show an extraordinary level of convergence. So even though they evolved independently, because of their similar biology and life history, under the microscope, they're quite similar in many ways. And they produce these filaments, the anastomose around the host. They can produce a proliferation of host cell tissue, so an expansion of the vine in which they grow. And then they send down these sinkers, which you can think of as analogous to roots, these lines of cells that tap into the vascular resources of their hosts. And they're really quite creepy, to be perfectly honest, in a non-biological sense. Now, my colleague Adrian Tobias, who's sitting to my right, kindly provided this very beautiful slide. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to be working with Pat Malabrigo and Adrian Tobias on some of the Rafflesias that grow here in the Philippines, which is the sort of international capital of Rafflesia species, which has only really come to attention relatively recently. There is an extraordinary diversity of these magnificent flowers growing in the Philippines. Again, on Adrian's slide, you can see his scaled images of Rafflesias across the different islands in the archipelago that make up the Philippines. Some 13 to 15 recognized species, depending on your species concepts, particularly in Luzon Island. So I'm in the right place, guys, to be looking at these flowers, and I'm very excited to be here. I'm just going to move on to this particular species, which is one that we are super excited. Well, we hope to see it. You can never guarantee a sighting of a Rafflesia. Any Rafflesiologist will tell you that, because they flower very unpredictably. But the experts that I'm surrounded by know how to track down these flowers better than anyone else. And this one is Rafflesia banoana, which grows in the Kalinga province, deep within the heart of a very special rainforest, very special part of the world. And here is Adrian and colleagues with the flower in 2019? Yeah, 2019. And it's a plant that is very similar to another species, Rafflesia leonardi from the Aurora province. But what we're really interested in is looking at some of the micro morphological details. So really getting down close to look at the detail of some of these flowers. The difficulty, the challenge with parasitic plants is that they are highly reduced. They no longer look like normal, in inverted commas, plants. And this sometimes can obscure the taxonomic relationships between plants. And you really have to look at micromorphological details, which is what Adrian has been doing. And he and Pat kindly invited me to join them to start examining these plants in greater detail. And as I say, I'm very excited that we have the prospect of finding it in a week's time. We're also interested in the pollination ecology of these extraordinary plants. Now, what I didn't say about Rafflesia, though you probably know it already, is that it smells absolutely foul. So as if it wasn't enough that it steals and pilfers existence from other plants, it also dupes insects into pollinating it. So this is one big fraudster in the plant kingdom. It mimics a giant rotting corpse to attract flies to pollinate it. And these flies are offered no reward. So when we think of pollination, we think of it as in nice terms, you know, this ancient bartering system between insects and plants in which everyone's happy because the insects get a hit of sugary nectar, the plant gets pollinated, the flowers smell nice, you know, it's a nice story. Not so with Rafflesia. It mimics a giant rotting corpse to attract pollinating flies and tricks them into thinking that they found a food supply for their offspring. Which is really quite incredible. It's actually evolved multiple times again across the plant kingdom. It's called Sapromyophyllae, and they tend to be quite big flowers, which might be because flies like big resources to lay their eggs on. Because, you know, the bigger the dead animal, the better the resource for their offspring, right? But we're interested to understand a bit more about the how and why of this pollination syndrome. But before I go on to that in Rafflesia, I want to refer briefly to another project that I'm working on, which we would like to now apply to Rafflesia. So working with my colleagues in the Department of Chemistry at the University of Oxford, we've been looking at aeroids, members of the Aeraceae family. And this is an intriguing group of plants because, like Rafflesia, they trick their pollinators into a false promise of a reward because it rewards them with nothing. And so they mimic horrible smelling things to attract flies. But what we find particularly interesting about these plants is that they don't all smell of dead meat. Some of them smell of animal droppings. So it's pretty unpleasant. And they attract, therefore, different types of flies. So the ones that smell of carrion, of dead meat, they attract different pollinators to those that smell of dung. And so we've been using a methodology to extract some of these compounds, which is something that scientists have done before in lots of these groups of plants. But specifically, we'd like to understand at the level of the chemical signature, if you like, of these plants, how much they differ from one another and how much they resemble the things they're mimicking. And on the slide that you're hopefully seeing now, you'll see a series of graphs, and the ones in red at the top are the plants that smell of dead animals. And then the three black graphs at the bottom are the ones that smell of animal dung. And what I hope you can notice is that there are some peaks in common with those that smell of dung that are not shared by those that smell of dead meat. In other words, at a chemical level, these scent signatures are very different, but they're also different at a species level. So different species have different chemical signatures, and we just don't know what that means in terms of which pollinators they're attracting. And so when we think back to Rafflesia, which produces these, in a way, different shapes and sizes of flowers, what we'd like to understand is a little bit more about what are those pollinating insects and what are the chemical signatures of these extraordinary flowers, and how might those things interrelate. On the next slide, I've just shown a very special picture that my colleague sent me from Bogor Botanic Garden in Indonesia, which perhaps some of you will know, which is famous for having propagated Rafflesia, which is notoriously difficult to grow. This is not something that you can go out and just collect seeds of, plant them on a tetrastigma vine and hope for the best. It really doesn't work that way. It's got a very complicated life cycle. It's very difficult to recreate the conditions needed for Rafflesia to grow. And that probably because we don't yet understand enough about its dependencies in the ecosystem and its complex biology. But the guys at Bogor, through a stroke of genius, have worked out how to graft tetrastigma infected with Rafflesia onto vines to propagate the plants. And so one of the things that, chatting to Pat and Adrian here in the Philippines, that we'd love to do is to work with the guys in Indonesia to understand more about that methodology, such that we might be able to apply it to the conservation of these very special plants here in the Philippines. So in summary, for the research on Rafflesia, it's really sort of threefold. We'd like to look in detail at the morphology and the taxonomy of some of the more poorly understood taxa in the Rafflesia that grow here. Secondly, we'd like to understand the reproductive ecology and biology of different Rafflesia species, and where better to do it than the Philippines, as I say, the capital of Rafflesia. And then longer term, we'd like to understand a bit more about how we might successfully propagate these plants, which would really help the conservation of these extraordinary botanical enigmas, many of which are exceptionally rare or endangered in the wild. Moving on, there are some other parasitic plants which are easier to grow, which are in the Orobanchaceae. So this is a family that I work on and have worked on for many years. This is a family that includes both plants that can photosynthesize, so they do have green leaves, and those that have lost their leaves and chlorophyll. So the former we call hemiparasites, and those that have lost their chlorophyll we call holoparasites. And the holoparasites evolved from the hemiparasites. And on the next slide, I've shown a range of holoparasites. These are paintings I've done of various holoparasitic Orobanchaceae. I find these plants sort of curiously beautiful. They're not maybe conventionally beautiful, but they have very intriguing and unusual floral morphology. I'm now going to move on to a group of these plants that grows in the UK, where I'm from, which is the brimrates or Orobanchaceae. I'm not going to show every slide. The slide I'm showing now that hopefully has caught up is a bit of a complicated one, but I'll walk us through it. This is some research that I did some years ago, in which we showed that Orobanchaceae has evolved on different hosts, which may be driving the speciation, the evolution of new species in these plants. So I'll explain what I mean. On the left, that tree, in essence, shows that populations of Orobanchaceae growing on different hosts are genetically divergent. And then on the right, there are a series of micrographs which show how they respond on their different hosts. In a nutshell, if you can imagine parasites that maybe look the same and seem to be very closely related, but they grow on different hosts with differing ecologies, this acts as an allopatric barrier. It stops there from being gene flow between these populations, because they are allopatrically specialized to grow on their specific host. So this acts as a barrier, driving the divergence both at the physiological level, the cellular level underneath the soil, and the molecular level, so from the point of view of the population genetics. And so what we think is that parasitic plants may have diverged and formed new species because they have host specificity, which means they prefer growing on a specific kind of host. And for many parasitic plants, we don't yet understand the full range of their hosts, how they behave on different hosts, and how that may have driven the evolution of these extraordinary plants. And my interest and my passion for Orobanche has taken me up and down the UK, observing and scribbling these plants. So if the slide that you're looking at now shows some black and white images of Orobanche, these are all of the Orobanche that grow in the UK. So I went all over the place scribbling and sketching these plants to produce our British handbook that taxonomists can use to identify these plants, because they're quite difficult to identify in the field. And we found some surprises along the way. So on the next slide, I've shown a picture of a form of Orobanche that we called at a varietal status Heliophylla. And this is a form of Orobanche that has shifted from its natural vegetation, the host that it grows on, which would be in the Asteraceae, so members of the daisy family. It's moved onto something called a brachioglottis, which is a daisy shrub from New Zealand that we tend to grow in municipal plantings around the UK, and particularly outside retail parks. And so if you want to find this parasitic plant, the best place to look for it is outside IKEA in the car park, and sometimes outside other supermarkets. So you never know where interesting plants will turn up. I will skip this slide in the interest of time, but I just wanted to acknowledge my colleague, Fred Rumsey, with whom I did this work. And I want to move on to relatives of the broomrape, the Orobanche, the desert hyacinth, Sistanchi. And these are some of the most beautiful plants I know. I have to stop saying that, but there are so many beautiful plants. They're called desert hyacinths. They grow in the deserts of the world and sometimes sand dunes, from the Canary Islands in the west all the way across to China and all of the Middle Eastern deserts in between. And I've done quite a lot of survey work, for example, with Ori fragments here from Jerusalem Botanic Gardens, collecting and examining these extraordinary plants because their taxonomic relationships are very poorly understood. And this very talented field botanist called Dar Ben Natan has collected lots of these for us as well. He knows these plants in their habitats better than anyone else. And working with my other colleagues, for example, at Reading and at Kew, we've been looking at the taxonomy of these plants from across their range, and I'll explain why. So these plants are harvested for use in traditional herbal medicine and also harvested for food. And they've been used actually for thousands of years in some parts of the world for medicine. But this might be worrying if populations are being harvested unsustainably in a way that that endangers the plants. And if these plants are traded, we need to understand clearly which are the rare species and which are the ones that can be harvested sustainably. But unless we have robust taxonomy in place, then we can't do that. And so what we've been doing is a project to really go back to basics on these plants and to look at all of the type specimens and to examine these, to reconstruct the molecular phylogeny, to understand where the species limits lie in these wonderful plants. Just to show you a bit more about how these are harvested. So my student Majed took these photos in China, where you can see the plant has this massive underground stem that is dug up and harvested for so-called trophy benefits, so general health benefits for people. And these are some of the huge stems that are sold. You can see the people in the background for scale. They're the size of giant snakes, and they fetch a very high price. I won't dwell on the next slide, but just to say that we've been examining how they behave on different hosts. And what we find is that species are very confused. So there are two species in China, for example, that we think have been widely confused. And we need to understand better the species relationships among these plants in order to harvest them in a way that's sustainable. I'm just going to check with my colleagues the slide has caught up. Can you see the slide now? Yeah, great. Okay, so the next group of really weird plants in our Weird Plant Safari I want to show you is Hydnora. which relatively few botanists, I guess, have been lucky to see. I found it in 2008 in the Little Karoo Desert in South Africa. These are some of the weirdest plants imaginable. They grow on shrubby euphorbias and they erupt through the desert floor with these crazy inflorescences. These are relatives of the Aristolochias, so these are quite basal angiosperms. And for that reason, we're interested in understanding more about their evolutionary biology and how they behave on different hosts. And so together with my colleagues, Olwyn at Kew, Duncan at Sheffield, and our student Seb, we're hoping to examine the phylogeny and the taxonomy of these plants, but also how they behave on different hosts and what we might infer about some of the most primitive of the parasitic flowering plants. So that's a project that's only started recently, so I don't have any data yet to share with you. Next in our Weird Plant Safari is the Balanophoracea. I was very excited to find out that there are some Balanophoracea growing here in the Philippines. I hope, maybe I get to see some. The ones that you can see there in the middle are called Langsdorfias, which grow in South America. Some extraordinary looking plants that grabbed the headlines when we wrote a small paper on these a couple of years ago. And on the right, that strange potato-like structure is one that we've managed to grow at Oxford Botanic Garden. We're very keen to try to grow some of these plants for conservation and research purposes, but they're quite difficult to grow. I'm also working with Rob on a project to examine the demography of mistletoes in the UK, so to understand how they grow on different hosts, and how our tree planting efforts across the UK, we're actively looking to plant lots more trees. How might that affect the distribution of the parasite that grows on these trees? And just to say briefly that within that order to which the mistletoes belong, you get these an extraordinary diversity of very beautiful parasitic plants. I won't talk for too much longer, looking at the time, but I wanted to give a nod to Thismia and Oxygyna, which are some of these wonderful mycoheterotrophic plants that I mentioned earlier, the ones that are parasitic on fungi. And they're sometimes known as fairy lanterns, and I think you can see why from the slides. They're really quite bizarre looking. And these are some photographs that my colleagues Siti Munira and Domi Nikong in Malaysia took and shared with me. Together they kindly invited me to join them in examining and describing a new species of Thismia last year from Terengganu. These again are a group of plants that are poorly understood, and we're still understanding more and more every year about the species limits. And many of these plants have been seen only once or by one person, and then they sort of disappear. They're very tiny, they're sort of smaller than your little finger, and sometimes they never even appear above the leaf litter in the rainforest floor. So just one falling leaf is enough to obscure it, and you'd never know it was there. And so Domi, who discovered this species that we call Thismia sitemeriami, we named after his mother, he found it and has not been able to find it since. So some of these plants are exceptionally rare, and we have no idea how to grow these at all. So forget the other parasitic plants. These ones are, to all intents and purposes, impossible to grow pretty much, at least in a botanic garden setting outside of a lab. Okay, why am I sharing a picture of an inkjet printer? I will explain. I wanted to talk briefly about our research in biomimetics. On the right, I put a picture of an incredibly beautiful seed that I was lucky enough to be shown yesterday, called Alsomitra, that we found in the rainforest here in the Philippines. These are seeds like this are a source of inspiration to engineers who look at sort of aerodynamics. And the reason I shared that video of a lotus leaf is to show you how water behaves on its surface. This is an example of a superhydrophobic surface, so water is repelled very strongly. It has a minute granular structure, and it's covered with a layer of water repellent wax. And this has been the source of inspiration for self-cleaning paints. And so working with my colleagues here, these physicists, we examined more closely the peristome of Nepenthes, the pitcher plants that I mentioned earlier, because we wanted to understand how fluids and insects behave on this unusual surface. And I've magnified it many hundreds of times on the right. And you can see that it's made up of grooves, and those grooves are in turn made up of even smaller grooves or trenches. And the surface is wet, and this creates ideal conditions for things to slide up and down along these what acts as railings. And what we found using a series of experiments and mathematical modeling was that liquid droplets move along these grooved surfaces in a way that is highly controlled and non-arbitrary. What we also think is happening here is that insects don't just randomly slip around and slide all over the place. They slide in a way that is driven and controlled. So the plant effectively is driving these insects into the interior of the trap. But again, we understand very little about this. Oh yeah, I mentioned an inkjet printer. So this has an application in technology as well. So there are lots of technologies that we use in our daily lives that use small amounts of liquid that need to be moved with high precision. For example, microfluidics that's used in inkjet printers and also medical devices, refrigeration, and things like that. So there's an awful lot we can learn from plants. Just briefly, I also was very interested in these water lily leaves. And my colleagues, these physicists, they said to me one day, Chris, why do these leaves grow so large and how do they grow so big? And I said, well, I don't know. I have a guess, but I'm not sure. And so we set out to tackle that very question. How and why do the world's largest floating leaves, the giant Amazonian water lilies, grow so enormous? And look at this beautiful structure. If you flip one over, you get this wonderful geometry, a regular branching pattern. And that's actually the key to its success. So on the slide that you can hopefully see with all the graphs, we did a series of force indentation curves. So my colleagues produced these graphs, and on the bottom left, if I can draw your attention just to that graph, and you can see a series of grey, strange-looking discs. So the one at the bottom is a simple flat disc, like a small water lily. And then we looked at one that linearly increases in thickness towards the middle. Then we looked at just the veins, the girders of a leaf, and then we looked at a entire giant Amazonian water lily leaf. And in a nutshell, through a series of experiments and mathematical models, what we showed was that that is the optimal structure for a given amount of biomass for these leaves to be incredibly strong and enable them to grow in an environment where they need to grow quickly to push out the other aquatic vegetation. They need to be strong to enable wading birds to walk over them. And this enables them to grow in fast drying, watery environments where they can grow quickly, force the other plants out of the way, and occupy a large amount of surface area for photosynthesis, because effectively these leaves are, of course, giant floating solar panels. And this may also have applications in technology because engineers, technologists, and innovators are looking to nature for solutions to produce giant floating platforms, for example, for solar energy harvesting. And what better way to be inspired than to look in nature, because that's where the answers will lie. This is just a slide to show the scale of giant water lily leaves that you can hopefully see A and B on the graph versus the small familiar water leaf relative. And it shows you just how big those leaves really are. And the final part of my talk, before I finish, I said I wanted to talk about astonishing plants. And I've put some examples which are, I guess they generate a reaction, I think. Botanists like me and some of the people that I'm happy to be surrounded with at the moment here in the Philippines, we have quite a hard job to do to excite and inspire people with plants, because the reality is that most people, they find animals more interesting than plants. We know that. People have analysed that. And it may be because we are animals ourselves. It's sometimes been called zoo chauvinism. We're more in tune to see other animals. They move on our timescale. Plants are just as fascinating, but sometimes we have to look harder to see that. And we as botanists have to work very hard to encourage people, because at a time when 2 in 5 of the world's plant species are threatened with extinction, it's essential that we foster an excitement among younger generations so that we can encourage a new generation of botanists to seek to understand and conserve what they've inherited from us in the plant world. And one of the small ways we can do that is to excite people. Is to excite people with some of these extraordinary plants. And some of the plants that I've shared with you today have had the power to do that. So on the slide I'm showing now, you can see that some of the species that we've worked on ended up in the mainstream news. It wasn't our intention, and it wasn't why we worked on them, but I was very happy that they did, because anything that we can do to bring plants to people's attention and to help capture the beauty and the intrigue of the plant world for the general public. I think that's something that's really important, and it's a role that I take very seriously. I just wanted to end my talk to say a generic thank you to all these people on this slide, because there are too many to list. But I wanted to say that the work that I presented here is by no means just mine. There's a whole community of us out there working on some of these projects. So a big thank you to all my collaborators. But I wanted to say a special and very sincere thanks to my colleagues, Kat Malabrigo and Adrian Tobias, for inviting me here, making me feel so welcome, and for sharing what I think is the world's most extraordinary flora and plants with me this week. So thank you very much, and thank you all for listening.
Right. Wow. Isn't evolution really astonishing? It's really wonderful, right? So especially when I was looking at the pictures, and I was really fascinated with that water lily. It's like it's designed by nature to spread and to make sure that it survives and be a contribution to the ecosystem.
That's right. Yeah, it's a
wonderful presentation, Dr. Thorogood. So let's proceed to our question and answer. We have an open forum right now, and let me invite everyone who is here, both at Zoom and YouTube, to put in your questions at the chat box, and I will be reading them for Dr. Thorogood to answer. So let's just wait for a few moments. But before that, maybe I'll just check with the chat box here. We have already a question from Muhammad Ali Zul Hazim from, let me check. I think he's from University, Malaysia, Sabah. And
lucky him. A good place in the world to be.
Yeah. So the question is, may I know what is the reason for the Nepenthes to not have very green leaves or cup? Is it because of nutrient limitations?
No, it's due to attraction. So the pitches themselves are often shades of white or red, and they have markings that if you look at under a UV, it's not something that I specialize in specifically, but I understand from others that these colors serve as an attraction purpose. So rather like flowers attract pollinating insects, these vibrant colors attract insect prey. And then the lamina, the bit that looks like a leaf, the green part, that is where most of the photosynthesis probably happens. But it's not nutrient limitation for that. No, it's attraction.
Okay. So we have a question from Aldrich Joshua Reyes. He's a second-year biology student from the University of Nueva Cáceres in Camarines Sur here in the Philippines, and he has two questions. The first question is, have we observed, or probably have you observed any, or have you seen any Rafflesia species which are under speciation driven by host preference?
Yeah, really nice question. And so there are other scientists who work on Rafflesia who have published work examining the host specificity. And generally, I think it's fair to say that the view is that they grow on multiple different species of tetrastigma, but it's hindered by our lack of understanding of tetrastigma itself. So the host that it grows on, these vines, are taxonomically complicated and not well understood. And unless we know very well what those tetrastigmas are, and then we know very well what the Rafflesias are, and unfortunately there's some confusion in both, it's quite difficult to say for certain whether there have been host-triggered speciation events. So I think my answer would be, we don't know. There isn't evidence for it yet, but my gut feeling is that it may well be. And I would think in the evolutionary history of Rafflesia, I would expect that it has played a part. We know that over evolutionary time, Rafflesia has grown on other hosts. So it has parts of the cucurbitaceae in its genome. So it has shifted from different hosts over evolutionary time. And maybe still there is incipient speciation, but we're just not able to identify it yet.
Yeah. So that means we need more researchers working also in tetrastigma. No? All right. And the second question is, maybe you can answer, or probably some of the botanists here also. Is there a progress in the propagation of Rafflesia species here in the Philippines and or probably elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak for others who work on this because I've never worked on it specifically myself. I worked closely with Joko and Didik and colleagues at Bogor Botanic Garden in Indonesia, and those guys are generally considered the leaders at the forefront of Rafflesia propagation, and they've had great success with Rafflesia patma, which Joko told me a few weeks ago they've managed to get about 16 times, I believe. So they managed to graft it. And I know that many groups have tried. I know that many have failed from what we read in the literature. And by the way, it's great that those are published because failed experiments are just as important to learn from as the successful ones. I would think if there have been successful attempts here in the Philippines, that my colleagues here would have told me and we'd know. So I don't. So my feeling is no. I'm probably not the best person to ask, but my feeling is no. But chatting to my colleagues here, we're really excited about the idea that we should try in the future.
All right. Okay. So I hope that answers your question. Aldrich, I'm gonna shift to a question here in YouTube, and let me check. Oh, Stephanie Nilia is asking, any other animals attracted to parasitic plants other than the flies and the tree shoes? Tree
Yeah.
shoes.
So the tree shrews are on the carnivorous plants. So those are the plants that typically eat insects. And actually, there wasn't time to say, but those pitcher plants attract all sorts of different things. There's one called Nepenthes ampullaria, which traps leaf litter. So it acts as like composting bins. There are some that attract tree shrews, and the reality is that there are well over 100 Nepenthes species, and yet we don't really know what most of them are trapping. So there's a lot left to understand there. So that's the carnivorous plants. With the parasitic plants, these are attracting pollinators. So of course they don't want to kill those insects. They want them to act as couriers for their pollen. And yes, there are some that attract flies like Rafflesia. But a colleague of mine in Japan has examined the pollination ecology of some other plants. And there are all sorts of interesting things. For example, crickets and cockroaches that have been seen visiting parasitic plants. Meanwhile, Thismia, which I showed earlier in my slide presentation, the fungal parasites, these ones are visited by fungus gnats, so little insects that typically associate with fungi. So all sorts of different associations, yes.
All right. We have a question from Miss Erica Skadsen. She's from Portland, Oregon, USA. And the question is, do you find elevated levels of horizontal gene transfer in all Rafflesia species or indeed in all parasitic plants or mycoheterotrophics? I hope I got it right.
Yeah. The question sounds great. And I would defer to some of my collaborators, so particularly Charles Davis and colleagues at University of Harvard Herbaria, who've pioneered this research. And I worked with them on that paper, looking at how we compared fungal and plant parasites. But in short, yes, we think there are elevated amounts of horizontal gene transfer across parasitic plant groups. So it's not just Rafflesiaceae, but I think Rafflesiaceae are particularly prone to it because they have existed living inside the tissues of their host. So, you can't get more intimate than that. And so whilst not many species may have been examined in that way, I would expect there to be HGTs in all of them, quite honestly. But I know that Charles and his group have looked particularly at Sapria in the Rafflesiaceae and found highly elevated levels of horizontal gene transfer. So yes, it's elevated in parasitic plants because of their intimate associations, particularly in endoparasites because they live inside their tissues. And with mycoheterotrophic plants, I don't know if anyone's looked actually. Someone in the audience may know more than me, but I'm not aware of any literature looking at that. But I'm not sure.
Okay. We have 3 questions from Wilhelm Tan, and probably I'll just enumerate them one by one. The first question is, he's asking, why does the Philippines have a high diversity of Nepenthes and Rafflesia?
Yeah, so the Philippines lies in a part of the world that is extremely species rich anyway. So I also mentioned North Borneo, but really all of these islands here in the Old World Tropics are exceptionally species rich because of their geography and climate. The Philippines specifically as well, if you remember that map that my colleague Adrian had prepared for me, and I showed you all the different Rafflesia species, you can see that the islands are very much broken up. And so it's quite possible that the Rafflesia ended up on these fragments of land and then became sort of allopatrically isolated from one another. So in other words, there wasn't the amount of genes flowing between them. They became isolated. And when populations become isolated on islands, that's the ideal conditions for radiations or the formation of new species. So I would suggest it's because of the very complex geography of the Philippines combined with a range of different conditions and altitudes and forests, and the fact that this is one of the most important places for plant diversity on the planet anyway, being in Southeast Asia.
Thank you. And the second question is: are Diptera the only insects that visit Rafflesia to pollinate?
Yeah, I mean, guys, have you seen anything other than Diptera visiting Rafflesia? No.
No. So for the record, so far Diptera only.
Diptera only.
Unless probably some of our students will be dedicating their time and efforts to regularly check.
I mean, I guess you might get the odd confused butterfly lands on it by mistake or something, but I guess we also have to remember that there are floral visitors and there are pollinators, and they're not necessarily one and the same, because many things might visit something, they might just land on it by chance. Yeah. But I guess the question is it actually visiting, picking up pollen and then delivering it somewhere else? And I'm pretty sure it'd just be Diptera. But
all right. So the third question is the captive culturing of Nepenthes, especially by private individuals or those probably gardens or establishments? Maybe it's for your opinion, is it good or not?
I guess I think it depends on how it's done and if it goes through the correct process. I think having plants in ex situ collections, even in private collections, can be good if it stops people from then taking things from the wild.
From the wild.
Yeah. So I think there can be, but I'm very cautious in my answer, because clearly there's no place for someone going out to the wild and taking something. But I think if some, and I work in a botanic garden, and so we work, we, like the institutions I'm working with here, we go through a series of very rigorous processes by which to do seed collecting of material, and then accessioning it into living collections and seed banks. In the horticultural industry, I don't know about how that's done, and I think with the enhancement of tissue culture and propagation techniques, particularly for Nepenthes, which are quite easy to grow, by the way, in many cases from cuttings and from seed, there's every reason for us to be able to grow them in collections and not take them from the wild, which is a good thing. So my belief and my hope is that there are very few cases still of people taking these plants from the wild. But I know in other plant groups, some of the geophytes, the bulbs and things in Mediterranean parts of the world, I've seen it with my own eyes, that people go out and dig them up and I guess sell them on the internet, but it's a massive problem still. And as we know, particularly with cacti and succulents. So it's not an area that I know too much about, to be honest, and I haven't seen it firsthand, but I have in other plant groups, and it is concerning.
Yeah. So I'll switch to a question from YouTube. Ellen Vito is asking, would you know if there is a close relationship among parasitic plants in terms of molecular data? Probably is Nepenthes related to like other parasitic plants?
So are we talking parasitic or carnivorous, did you ask?
Parasitic, specifically parasitic plants.
Parasitic plants evolved 12 times from different ancestry among flowering plants. And so within those 12 occurrences, they each evolved from a common ancestor that then diverged each time to form different ones. but those 12 lineages are not related to one another. So we know that it's evolved those 12 times. There's also a parasitic gymnosperm, I should mention, called Parasitaxis uster, which grows in New Caledonia. So there's one, to our knowledge, parasitic gymnosperm. So one gymnosperm, 12 parasitic kinds of angiosperm lineages, and they're not related to one another.
All right. Okay, this is a live question. Maria Kalila Gonzalez, she's a BS biology student from Xavier University. I think it's from Mindanao. She's asking, do you have any advice for young scientists, probably like her, who is trying to find the community or some colleagues or peers, to have an aligned vision like what you have right now? Of course, there's a community of botanists that specialize on Rafflesias and other parasitic plants. And how did you get to where you are now? Education, experience-wise.
What a nice question. So I'll answer that in reverse. So I'll do the second part first. So kind of my philosophy is do what you love and love what you do. The very word career has two meanings. Yes, it means to go from job to job, but also in the English language, career also means to go from side to side. So if you career in a car, it goes like this. And I like the fact that it has that double meaning, because many careers go from side to side. And my career path hasn't been in a straight line, and it hasn't always been how I wanted it to. And I've not met many people who's have. And so my advice would be that if you're passionate about it and you love it, then stick at it. And you might encounter people who tell you that things aren't possible. I've had this my whole life. Actually just believe in what you do and believe it's possible, and work hard at it. So that's about the career part. And then in terms of the first part of the question, I think was sort of advice. And I know from talking to Adrian, for example, who's sitting a meter away from me, that he's been very proactive at sort of setting up groups using whatever kind of social media it is, of like-minded young taxonomists to share information and work together. So I would be sort of really proactive in getting your name out there, even if it's not in formal publications, but networking with other people. There's a whole community of taxonomic botanists, particularly in Southeast Asia. It's a really impressive community of purpose across Southeast Asia, seeking to understand the taxonomy and what that means for the conservation of plants. So just be a part of that. And, I look forward to hearing how you get on.
Right. Okay, so our next question is from Paul Andrew Ibarra, and his questions are, what are the reasons, or what are the drivers of the extinction of these the plants that you have already presented, and are they being exploited? And another is, are there any predators or anything else that probably could eat these parasitic plants?
Yeah, I guess it depends which ones we're talking about. So the desert hyacinths that I mentioned have been highly exploited historically, and so it's important that we understand what is what, so that we understand which ones are being exploited. So there are some that are. Rafflesia, to my understanding, have also been exploited, not so much here in the Philippines by people, but in other parts of Southeast Asia for various reputed benefits that the plants bring and traditional use. So yes, historically these plants have, and I think if we think about how we use plants, people all over the world have always used plants for we use them all in our everyday lives now, the clothes we wear, the food we eat, the medicines we take, but people have always used them for traditional herbal medicine. I think that now it's different because we have additional pressures, we have a growing population, and we have habitat destruction. And so it's a perfect storm for some plants. If they're not that common already, their habitat has been reduced, and then they are being used, and by a growing population of people, then that can be a problem. So I think, and this also links to the taxonomy. Once we understand what different species are, we can then assign them a conservation status effectively, and we can put safeguards in to protect them and understand how their population is changing. But if we don't know it's there in the first place, then we can't protect it. So that's, I didn't know which ones your person asking the question was wondering about, but those are some general points.
All right. Okay. We have Ma'am Julie Barcelona here. He's from the University of Canterbury. Fantastic presentation. Congratulations. Let me read this. But the question is, have you observed other insects besides flies that pollinate Rafflesia? I think you've already answered that. Probably you could just give clarifications.
Yeah, lovely question. And again, I don't know that I'm the best person to be answering this, because I haven't spent those hours in the field observing as some people have. But from what I'm told from others who have, and the people in the room with me who've spent many more hours than I have looking at these flowers and being visited by insects and getting into the flowers, taking photographs, nothing other than flies. But what we're really interested to know is, what are those species of fly, and are they different in the different Rafflesia flowers? Because they do seem to appear and smell quite different across the genus. There are some that don't really smell, Rafflesia pricey I saw many years ago, but it smells more fungal and it doesn't even smell particularly strong or unpleasant. Whereas one I've seen quite recently wasn't that strong but smelled horrible. They're different, and so we'd love to understand what are the species that are visiting them, and how do those fragrances differ chemically. But I don't have any answers yet, I'm afraid, Julie. But thank you for the question.
All right. So a question from Christian Genesis Ginto, and he's senior high school science teacher here in the Philippines from Quezon Province, and his question is, how can I make my learners appreciate more of these parasitic plants, which you have already shared with us?
Yeah. So in school, generally, often, not always, but in a school syllabus on plant biology, there tends to be a strong focus on often plant physiology or biochemistry, like photosynthesis. And I'm sad to say that quite often the undergrads who start their courses with me doing biological sciences, I hear all too often, I don't like plants, don't find plants interesting. I like animals, I like zoology. And I'm pleased to tell you that they don't end their course feeling that. But there is a problem in schools, and it's an international problem, and you see it and hear it everywhere, that kids often don't necessarily feel as stimulated and excited by plants. Perhaps many teachers don't either, and therefore there isn't that infectious enthusiasm, or perhaps it's not in the syllabus, or it's all those things. I also think it is generally harder to excite people about plants because they instinctively find animals more interesting, because they move on our timescale. And therefore, my advice is to show some really astonishing examples of plants that your students just would never have even dreamt of. And also plants that invite questions, like a Venus flytrap. Very few people can watch a Venus flytrap and not be fascinated by its formidable jaws, how it's able to move, how it's able to function. And often these plants are then a hook, because once students start asking questions about that plant, it's a springboard onto a discussion about plants more generally. Orchids are another good place to go as well. Orchid pollination, can't go wrong.
Right. Okay. From Matt Sklodowski from the University of Warsaw Botanic Garden. The question is Rafflesia seed dispersal somehow related to the feeding of large mammals like deer? Would deer be responsible for this?
Lots of different theories about this have been generated, and some data. My view, and again, having not spent as much time as others looking at Rafflesia, but my view from piecing together what I've seen is that we don't yet have a clear picture about the dispersal of these seeds. I mean, we've been having conversations about this in the field just in this last few days. Yes, large mammals have been suggested, elephants, for example. There have been small mammals observed feeding on the fruits. Ants have been proposed. The reality is many different things have. And personally, I don't feel I've seen enough of a correlation and a consensus among scientists to be able to say with confidence how these seeds are dispersed. So as I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, it's quite intriguing, isn't it, that the world's largest flowers are the world's largest enigmas, because we have more questions than answers.
All right. Maybe the deer is actually, putting his or her nose inside the Rafflesia or the parasitic plants. That's why it's dispersing the seeds. Right? Okay. Let me check. Okay, there's a question from Mark Castillo. He's from the Biodiversity Research Center, Academica Sinica, in Taiwan, and he wants to know whether the host-specific relationship of these plants, do they affect the global distribution, and to what extent does affect, if it does, and what are the factors that would be responsible for it?
Yeah, do you know, that's a question that intrigues me as well, and it's why we're interested in Hydnora, that crazy South African thing that looked like a mouth growing out of the desert, because that is of a lineage where half of them ended up in South America and the other half in Africa. And what I'd like for us to understand is, how does their host specificity vary, and do they have in their common ancestry the machinery for growing on certain hosts? So yes, very much the global distribution of a host will determine where a parasite can grow. And another example would be Orobanche minor, that broomrape that I showed you that grows outside IKEA. The fact that it grows on that host from New Zealand tells you that it can grow on lots of different hosts. This one has shifted from natural vegetation onto a host from New Zealand, from the other side of the planet. And because it can grow on lots of different hosts, this species has ended up all over the globe. It's been introduced in different areas. I mean, it doesn't really form much of a pest, but it just kind of pops up all over the place. Whereas most parasitic plants are quite restricted in what they can grow on. And for that reason, they're actually particularly sensitive. So a paper that I've got in press at the moment suggests that 76% of parasitic plants are completely absent from seed banks and botanic gardens. Actually, I think it's higher than that. But that's the best number that we could generate from the data we had available. So it's an added reason for us to be careful in how we protect these wonderful plants.
All right. A question from Cyrus Miliado from UP Mindanao, and he's curious if your studies, or if there are recent studies which can answer the question if plant parasitism is an ancestral trait or a recently derived trait, and what could have triggered this mode of adaptation or survival?
Yeah, lovely question. And if we think back to the Orobanchaceae family that I showed you, it's like a laboratory in itself, because you've got your hemiparasites, which have green leaves still, but they do take food from other plants. And then you have your holoparasites, which have lost their green leaves. Now, basically, I've split those quite artificially into two groups for simplicity, and it's not that simple. There is a transition from a plant that is entirely autotrophic and makes its own food, like most plants do, through to being entirely heterotrophic, where it steals everything, like Rafflesia, for example. But there's a transition, and the holoparasites, the ones with no leaves and chlorophyll, evolved from the hemiparasites. And so if we think back over evolutionary time, somehow plants that grew in very close association to other plants, maybe if you imagine they grew with in a rhizosphere where the roots were all enmeshed, and you had the roots of one plant growing right next to another one, something may have facilitated a root grafting event, and that this close proximity somehow enabled one root to latch onto another. And this may have given the plant a selective advantage, because obviously it didn't have to make its own food, it could steal it from others. And so I think that, in short, the answer to the question is, it has its roots, pun unintended, originally in hemiparasitism. So plants that had leaves that stole some food. And then once they went down that route, they became more and more derived, until you end up with these extraordinary parasites that look nothing like their ancestors. And to illustrate the point even more, Rafflesia, the closest ancestors of these extraordinary plants, are euphorbias, which produce tiny little flowers. And botanists had no idea that was the case until they looked at the DNA of the plants.
Interesting. Okay. Here's a question from John Raymond Torres. This uh, about this long, but let me just read. I am intrigued by the idea that you mentioned about these extremely derived characteristics, and it seems or it appears to be like an it's analogous to the characteristic of some plants when you compare it to fungi.
Mm.
Like they have evolved that much to the extent that they have lost obvious plant characteristics, but now somehow resemble fungal characteristics.
Yeah, yeah.
So how do you see the possibility that some of these plant species that you have mentioned can be grouped in the future as under fungi?
To tackle that in reverse, they'll never be classified as fungi because they're all of their own kingdom. So genetically, completely different different things altogether. So they'll never be classed as fungi, and we know that.
Mhm.
But then to tackle the first part of the question, I find that quite intriguing because perhaps there is a reason that some of them look like fungi. So the Thismia species, the fairy lanterns that I mentioned, are pollinated by, in some cases at least we know, by fungus gnats, little tiny flies that reproduce on fungi. So perhaps there's a very good reason for Thismia to look like a fungus because it probably smells like one and attracts fungus gnats. So maybe in some cases there is a reason for them to look like fungi. In other cases, my suspicion is that it's just a coincidence because if a plant loses all of its leaves and green pigments and it becomes fleshy, it might look a bit more like a fungus to our eyes, but that may serve no purpose or have no significance. So it's a complicated answer.
From Kent John, and the question is it advisable to have locals learn how to propagate these parasitic plants in their gardens to promote conservation, and why or why not?
Yeah, it depends on the plant and its rarity. And I think, I mean, obviously we would hope that there'd be some level of sort of due diligence and process, because I don't think what we can do is encourage people to go and dig things up from the wild to try and grow them in their garden and then say it's for conservation. Not that I'm suggesting that's what your listener was saying, but I think there needs to be some level of sort of governance over sort of decentralizing all that kind of activity. The other thing is that they're really, really difficult. And so some of the guys, for example, at Bogor Botanic Garden in Indonesia, as I say, that they're fantastic at growing these things, but that's taken them decades of research and effort to get to the stage where they have. And arguably, they still only, really got one species to flower regularly. And that's taken an awful lot of time and effort and resource. And I think the reality is that much as we would like to be able to go and harvest things and be able to grow them in our gardens, I don't think that's a possibility or a reality. I mean, it adds to the intrigue of these extraordinary plants.
Again, from Mark Angelo Bucay, he's from the Biodiversity Research Center, Academia Sinica, Taiwan. Along the evolutionary line of parasitic plants, are there any known instance or possibility of reversal of niche from being parasitic to becoming non-parasitic?
The short answer is no. so once the plant has converted to heterotrophy, there's no return. so along the way, it loses the molecular machinery to be able to photosynthesize. So all of the genes and the molecular machinery that the plant has to be able to capture light and harvest energy and photosynthesize and all of that, it disappears. So no, it's committed to a life of crime.
All right. Okay. Okay. We have a lot of questions here, and probably, if you know, or probably Adrian, Sir Pat can also answer. Good afternoon. Noor Safinas Jelani is asking, when is the blooming season for Rafflesia species in the Philippines?
So I'm happy if others want to chip in as well, but I'm here in the middle of it.
Okay.
This is, well, what I call the spring. I know here people have described it as summer, different parts of the world, but sort of around March, April time. So, but of course, as I say, the Philippines is a complex geography and archipelago. So there are some species on some islands that you might see at different times of the year. But where I am at the moment, March is a pretty good time. Yeah.
Okay. From EJ San, and he's a botany student from the Central Luzon State University. He's just curious if there are aquatic plants that are also considered as parasitic. Are there?
I'm trying to think. You know what will happen? I'll say no, and then someone will email me afterwards and remind me of one. But off the top of my head, of the 12 lineages, this might be because I work in deserts a lot, but of the 12 lineages, I honestly cannot think of a single parasitic aquatic plant. No.
Right.
I can't think of any.
Let's just find out. Question from Michelle Marie Sibala, and she's a third-year biology student from Silliman University. I think she has a common question with Larkspur Alforque, who is who's also asking the same question. And what are the most common commercial uses of parasitic plants? And would you know if there are conservation efforts for these plants here in the Philippines?
Yeah, so common commercial uses. So generally, parasitic plants are well known, unfortunately, for becoming pernicious weeds. So there are plants, for example, striga, that cause massive harm to crops in sub-Saharan Africa and some other parts of the world. They've moved from the natural vegetation, like the one in IKEA, to crops, and they can cause massive damage, or a banky to an extent as well. So generally, when we talk about parasitic plants, in certain cases, they actually are pests rather than useful agriculturally. The exception that I can think of is the Sistanki, which is now farmed at scale in China. So the Chinese have worked out how to grow this. It's not that easy, but they've done it, and they now farm it at great commercial scale. And I've worked with Chinese co-authors to describe some papers on how they do that. And actually, if I may, I'll carry on to say it's actually quite interesting, because they plant Sistanki alongside what are called shelter forests, which are bands of vegetation planted to prevent land degradation. So I'm sitting here in the tropics, but in some parts of the world, deserts are spreading like a rash over the land and causing a big problem. And if you plant a belt of vegetation of desert trees, it acts like a fire break, and it stops the spread of that. Now you can grow Sistanki on those desert trees as an ancillary crop. So something that is a solution to desertification, part of a climate change problem, you can actually, as part of the solution, by growing these shelter forests, you can grow the parasite on it with no fertilizer, no irrigation, no intervention. And there you've got an added crop that can then be harvested sustainably. So that's a really interesting and exciting example, I think. I can't remember if I answered all the question. It was a long question.
Anyway, maybe I think you've already answered this one from Jess Stephen Amahit. And the question is vegetative propagation possible for endoparasites like Rafflesia, for example? Maybe you would like just to add more.
Yeah. So, I mean, what the guys in Bogor have done effectively is to cut out a piece of tetrastigma infected with the endoparasite, graft that onto an uninfected vine, and then what happens is that the graft of the host establishes, because it's the same species, and then the parasite survives and then ramifies and spreads out into the rest of the plant, and therefore you've moved some Rafflesia from one plant to another. So effectively, yes, but it's difficult.
Question from Lyle May Rosal, and the part which is interesting to Lyle is, when you were talking about how they are dependent to other organisms in terms of nutrition. And parasitic plants have a very complex food web structure. And the curiosity lies, where does parasitic plants, or where do parasitic plants belong in the food web? Do they? Does this mean that it will be critical for them to be propagated due to this complexity in the food web structure?
Yeah, but nice question. And so in temperate grasslands, there is a hemiparasite called yellow rattle, and lots of researchers have studied this particular parasite. My colleague Duncan Cameron at Sheffield is one of them, and what they have found is that the hemiparasite preferentially takes its food from grasses and suppresses the dominance of grasses, and therefore that enables the room for other wildflowers to prosper. And so what this shows us in that particular case is that parasitic plants can have a profound impact on the ecosystems in which they exist. To what extent that occurs in other parasitic plants has not been studied, but we might assume that parasitic plants have an impact on ecosystem structure because they might suppress the dominance of their hosts. And then the second part of the question was, I've lost the question again.
Does it mean they will be critical? It will be
Oh,
critical
yeah.
for them to be propagated.
Yeah, well, I would say it means they're harder to conserve because there's an added layer of complexity because you need the host plant to prosper and then the parasitic plant. So they're hard to grow in many cases. And yes, they're more threatened, I think it's fair to say, because there's that added level of trophic complexity. So they really are quite vulnerable. I mean, we at Oxford Botanic Garden, we managed to grow one recently, Balanophora tobarica, on its host. And this is the kind of problem you have. We over-infected the host, and the host now looks like it's dying. And so we've got a parasite that's trying to grow on a host that's declining. And that's the kind of thing that you learn along the way. And so I have a paper coming out, hopefully soon, to explain some of these lessons that we've learned in trying to grow these plants, in which my colleagues in Bogor are co-authors, and they talk about Rafflesia as well. But I'm hopeful that will excite interest in other botanic gardens to try growing some of these and to share learnings, because that's how we'll be more powerful as a network of botanic gardens, to share our learnings of our successes and failures with these plants so that we can try to grow more of them.
Question from Charlene Esteban, and the question is, are parasitic parasitic plants and carnivorous plants, are they able to communicate with each other? Like there's a theory among the fungi that there's some sort of networking through the mycelia, something like that. Would this be also present for parasitic and carnivorous plants?
Yeah, I'll answer that question indirectly, actually, because communication is a word that we use for all sorts of different things. Like we're communicating now. It's effectively is like a signal between one organism and another, isn't it? And so,
yes.
in a sense, yes, because if you think of the seed of a parasitic plant, it responds to chemical cues produced by the roots, for example, of its host. So the seeds may sit in the soil and do nothing sometimes for a long period of time. And then when the right chemical signal from the host is emitted, the seed will respond to that, germinate, and then latch onto its host. And so in a sense, there's a form of communication there in that the seeds are responding to chemical cues from their hosts. And actually, I think we can say again that there's an elevated level of communication between plants in the form of host and parasite. So HGTs, the horizontal gene transfers that we talked about earlier, but also viruses and proteins and mRNAs and all sorts of things can move across the vascular connection point between a host and its parasite. So in a way, if we think of communication in its broadest terms, then I think parasitic plants particularly are very good candidates for communication among plants. There's a lot of it.
Okay. We have a comment here from Elaine Geronimo, and to answer Mr. EJ's question earlier, he says the bladderwort, he thinks is an example of an aquatic carnivorous plant.
Carnivorous plant, but not parasitic.
But not parasitic. All right. Okay.
Yeah. It was parasitic plants your listener was asking for.
All right. And from Lian Daniel Bertrudes, and he's a BS Environmental Science student from Cavite State University. And he would like to ask if there is a community health risk of having, parasitic plants near you.
No, no, no. They enhance my mental health and well-being. So quite the opposite. No, no risk at all.
Okay, there's no risk. Okay. From Christian De Villa, from Southern Luzon State University here in Lucban, Quezon. Just want to ask if there are known ethnobotanical uses of parasitic plants. I think you partially mentioned it
Yeah.
in your presentation, but would you know if there are uses here in the Philippines?
I'm looking to my colleagues
Mhm.
who will tell me if they know of any ethnobotanical uses of plants in the Philippines, parasitic plants in the Philippines. No, apparently,
No,
is what they're telling
no
me.
known, no
No,
information yet. Okay.
no.
I think I've skipped a question. Maybe let me check again. Okay. Um, in your fieldwork, have you observed any effect of global warming to the evolution of carnivorous and parasitic plants?
Um, it's a difficult question, isn't it? Because it's so hard to separate my subjective observations and inference with data. And as a scientist, I like everything to be substantiated by data. So what I'm going to say is anecdotal and observational. But
Mm-hmm.
um, yes, a little. But I think others have seen far more. The ecosystems that I've looked at and the parts of the world I've been to haven't necessarily suffered as much as some parts. But if typhoons are going to become a more severe, pernicious, and frequent event that can wipe out a forest ecosystem, and if they're occurring more rapidly, more frequently than they once did, then that could potentially be a threat. So yeah, it's very much a massive concern and a threat. I haven't seen too much of that firsthand, but obviously so many others have, which is devastating.
Question from Carl Arman Kabantak, and he's an Master's of Biology student at St. Mary's University in Bayombong, Nueva Vizcaya, and he's curious if you have encountered or have there been studies on bioactivities, which are being manifested among parasitic plants.
What do we mean by bioactivities?
Bioactivities, maybe for like this is a very general question. Maybe we could just park it for a while.
Okay.
Okay.
Come back to it.
Okay. We have a question from Red Spar Jalilula. I think that this already has been answered. The question is: parasitic plants can cause harm to other species of plant around it. Can they?
Yeah, they can particularly in artificial systems, by which I mean agriculture. Mm-hmm. So in the natural ecosystem, I've very rarely seen any evidence of harm, even if a parasitic plant might harm an individual, which you can see sometimes. At a population level, you don't often see it. But in an agricultural, artificial setting where you've got a monoculture of crops, it can be devastating because, of course, you've got one host multiplied by millions that the parasite can infest.
Okay, so that also answers the question of Rommel Fernandez. Okay. And we have Tristan Montemayor, a biology student from Central Mindanao University, and he would like to ask if there are any efforts from your team to collaborate with local governments or NGOs for the active conservation and protection of these parasitic plants, probably here in the Philippine setting. That's why Chris is right here now.
Yeah, so Oxford Botanic Garden and Arboretum, where I work, is a very small institution, I should say. So there are only 40 staff across the Arboretum and the Botanic Garden. There aren't many of us, and so the acknowledgements at the end that I gave of all my collaborators, they're a wonderful group of people all over the world who I work with on different projects. So I think, and there are different parts of the world where we focus our efforts. I would love to work with organisations to protect parasitic plants, and I'm very open to new collaboration. There are only so many hours in the day, so sometimes I have to limit myself a bit. But I'm very open to collaboration of that nature. So if anyone listening has any ideas or enterprises and they think that we could work with them in some way, and as you say, that's why I'm here. So please do get in touch.
All right. So we have a question, comment from Ron Vincent Alcon, and it's pertaining to the bioactivity, and it could probably mean if there is antioxidants, antifungal properties, something like that.
I thought maybe that was what was being referred to. So yes, I believe there's quite a lot of work looking at the digestive juices of Nepenthes pitchers. And properties associated with that, which I'm not very well versed. It's not an area that I work on. I'm not very well versed to say. In terms of the parasitic plants, one of the very well studied examples is Sistanki, the desert hyacinth that I mentioned, which is harvested. And there are some pharmacologically very well characterized taxa because there's so much interest in it. And it is purported to have benefits for human good. I wonder also if it's compounded by the fact that if you look hard enough for something, you'll find more. And I think it's because it's a plant that's been used for thousands of years and there's so much interest in it. I'm not a pharmacologist, by the way, but that we've examined it and therefore found some benefits in there. What I'm trying to say is there may be many other plants out there that have all sorts of benefits, but we just haven't looked. So sorry, it's a bit of a vague answer because we probably don't know that much.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Oh, Chris, I'm
still here.
No. I was just looking at YouTube, and it was on mute. So I thought you were still speaking.
Oh.
Okay. So we'll be answering just a few more questions before we wrap up. And let me just check. Okay, from Phil Anthony Sumabat, and he is asking can tissue culture be used for conserving holoparasitic plants like Rafflesia?
Yes, potentially. I think there probably needs to be more effort and work on it. So, as I say, there are some very active researchers in Southeast Asia looking at the propagation of Rafflesia, but not that many really. If you think about it, if you think about certain crop plants and the amount, and Arabidopsis and the amount of research that goes into those plants. So I think there could be more of a place for tissue culture. There has been some research in tissue culture with sort of mixed success. I don't think it's fair to say that we have here is an SOP and here is how we'll do tissue culture that we would be able to roll out and for people to use in different places. So there's been a little bit of success, but I think there needs to be more work to establish something that could be replicable. So lots more to be done. So much more to be done.
Incidentally, Maria Karina Lut Vizcaya, she's willing to collaborate here in conserving parasitic plants. She's based in the Bicol region. Okay.
Lovely.
Okay. And related to that, probably you could we will. Is it okay to post your email address later for them to write you?
Yes, my email address you can, but you will get an out of office at the moment for obvious reasons. I'm here
because you're in the field.
The other place you can get hold of me, I'm quite responsive at the moment, is on Twitter, in which my handle is Thorogood Chris 1, I think. Sorry, it's not very imaginative. or on Instagram, which is Illustrating Botanist. So if you find me on there, then we can link up and talk.
Yeah, just drop a line or so on Chris's social media handles.
Maybe someone will write it for me in the chat.
Yeah. Okay. From Jackie, is it possible to cross-pollinate Rafflesia species?
Yeah, it should be, and I think Jamili Nays, who worked on these plants in Malaysia and Borneo, did a wonderful piece of work. His famous hardback book on Rafflesia of the world, and he reports lots of experiments that he did to gather empirical data, including looking at the reproductive biology. there's no reason why you couldn't cross-pollinate them. And I should say at this point that the flowers are unisexual. So you have a male Rafflesia and you have a female
Female.
Rafflesia. And so if you had them opening at the same time, which if you had a large population, there's a probability that you might, you tend to get more male. It's reported that you have more male flowers than female in most species. That's so I've read. That's what people have observed. But in theory, there's no reason why, if you had a male and a female flower of the same species open at the same time, you couldn't transfer the sticky pollen from the relevant place in the male flower to the female, and that it wouldn't work. I can't see any reason why that wouldn't work.
Right, that's good news. And let me just okay, scan the chat box. I will just have the last question. We'll be ending the open forum after this. Oh, is there a connection between carnivorous plants and low nutrient soil? You know, on the basis of on the aspect of evolution.
Yeah, absolutely, there is. Yeah, so carnivorous plants, without exception, evolved in environments where nutrients are scarce, because to invest energetically in those elaborate leafy tracts that they produce is a very expensive process for a plant, energetically, and it wouldn't work if it was in a nutrient rich environment, because the other plants around it would outcompete it. So it can only pay off to produce those expensive, energetically speaking, tracts if the plant is an environment where there are low nutrients, because that's where feeding on insects gives it a really big advantage compared with the other plants around that it can outcompete with. So if you think back to that early slide where I said it has to grow in an environment where there's lots of sunlight, it also has to be an environment where there's very low nutrients, and that's what makes these traps so effective. And in fact, I should also say that if you feed your carnivorous plants, in some cases it will stop growing traps because there's no need for it to do so, and actually it generally then looks quite unhappy.
Right. Thank you. So before we end, I think there's something, a message here. We will not be able to give out a soft copy of the webinar presentation, but please do check our YouTube account, youtube.com/UPLB Museum. We will be uploading a copy of the webinar recording. So stay tuned. Probably in 2 or 3 days, we will be uploading the recording, and we will be emailing all of the registrants so that you will be informed of the recording. Okay,
can I just say thank you for all those wonderful questions as well. I don't think I've ever had, I've never had so many
questions
and such a range and so interesting. So I really enjoyed the Q&A. So thank you so much to all the listeners.
Okay, thank you, Sir Chris, for accepting our invitation, and to all of our supporters here at the UPLB Museum of Natural History Biodiversity Seminar. Thank you for being active once again, and we hope that we will be able to bring you another webinar by the end of March. And before we go towards the closing program, let me just share my slide. Okay. So let me give this certificate of appreciation to Dr. Chris Thorogood for serving as our resource person. And the certificate reads as this certificate is awarded to Dr. Chris Thorogood for serving as a resource person during the UPLB Museum of Natural History Biodiversity Seminar on Parasitic Plants, held March 9, 2022, from 2 to 3:30 p.m. via Zoom, and it's signed by our director, Dr. Marian P. De Leon. So maraming salamat. Thank you very much, Sir Chris, for accepting our invitation and for a very nice, scientific, and very, very interesting presentation.
It was my great pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
A big warm applause to our speaker. And don't forget, if you want to check out our website, go to mnh.uplb.edu.ph. Write us at mnh.uplb@up.edu.ph. We have lots of social media accounts. We are on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube and Instagram. Just look for the handle UPLB Museum and our articles, UPLB Museum of Natural History on Wikipedia and TripAdvisor. So with that, thank you very much, Sir Chris, for that wonderful presentation, and good luck on your research activities there at the land grant. I know you're enjoying right now.
I am
doing
I'm
your
very
field work.
excited.
I was astonished that you were actually at land grant. I thought you were here at campus.
I've got wet hair from being out in the land grant.
All right. So with that, maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat. Thank you very much, and wish you all the best. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.